We started looking for information about Mario Benedetti, and then we built our project called Recorrido Mario Benedetti.
We went to some of the places Mario mentioned in his work and learned about the structure, the history, and the most important characteristic of each place. We also learned how important was each place to him.
At the moment of sharing information, students talked about each place and the way Mario thought and thought about them. Our parents talked about the literature world in which he mentioned each place, and it was a memorable experience.
In 1973, the end of 1973, I was doing some research in Buenos Aires, and I was living there, and it was kind of a coincidence because American citizens don't need a visa for Argentina, but you can only stay for 90 days without a visa, and then you have to leave the country and come back in again. That's the easiest way. So I had to leave and come back in again. And I decided to go to Montevideo for the weekend. My connections with Montevideo were two. One was a friend, an Argentine woman that I had known in Spain many years ago when I hitchhiked around. I was a student, and I used to go to a student residence in San Sebastian that was a cheap, safe place to stay. And she was a Dominican nun, and she helped to run that place. And we wrote to each other afterwards. I knew she wasn't a nun anymore. And I knew the last time I had heard from her, she was Argentine. She was back here. The other was a friend of my father's, who was a Jewish immigrant from Central Europe. When my father came to the United States, they had quotas. They only let a certain percentage of people who wanted to come into the United States from each country. And my father was lucky, he was able to get in, but many of his friends were not. And so many of them went to Latin America, Mexico, Buenos Aires, Lima, Montevideo, Sao Paulo, and settled here. And one of them came to Montevideo. So I wanted to look for those two people. And I found my father's friend really easily because it was a well-known family and they had a business on Calle Soriano. They had a store. All I had to do was go there. Finding my friend was a little more complicated, and when I did find her, she was in the Cárcel de Mujeres. She had been involved with the Tupamaros, and she had been arrested. And I went over there and asked if I could see her, and it took some doing. It wasn't easy. but they let me in to see her. And it was very emotional because we hadn't seen each other for many years, and what are you doing here? You know, it was a very unusual situation. But for a few minutes, when we first came together, we were able to speak French to each other. Before the people who were listening to the conversation told us that if we didn't want them to throw me out, we had to speak Spanish because they were listening to everything we said. And in French, she was able to tell me that she had been very badly treated. She was able to give me the name of her lawyer, and I promised to go see him and see what I could do to help my friend out, and also because I don't think it's okay to torture people, to deny them due process, and all those things that went on here, unfortunately, during the dictatorship. I was able to talk to her lawyer. I had studied a lot about Latin America because my doctorate is in Hispanic literature, but I have a master's degree in Latin American studies. So I knew what the political situation in Uruguay was, but I didn't know to what degree the government of my country, through the U.S. Embassy, was supporting the military government. And of course, if the government of my country was sending money, where did that money come from? Partly it came from the taxes I pay. And when I took a look and really found out more about what was happening here, I was very uncomfortable thinking that my money was being used for that. So I went back to Buenos Aires, and I knew Mario and I knew Eduardo Galeano.
In Buenos Aires.
In Buenos Aires. They were both living in exile.
Mario in Buenos Aires.
Yeah. I knew them because I liked their books. And I knew that they were both engaged in opposition to the dictatorship. So I went to see them. And I didn't know Mario well. I knew him just, you know, a little bit superficially, but it was a cordial relationship. It wasn't hard to get to see him because he never refused to talk to anybody. And so I told him about that experience I had just had, and I said, as a U.S. citizen, maybe I can help change this. Who should I talk to? And he said, you have to talk to Salman Michelini, and he's my best friend, so I can put you in touch with him. And then I started to work with Salman, and that whole, as a result of that whole experience, Mario and I became very, very close friends. It was a mixture of professional collaboration and shared values, and we maintained that friendship for many, many years while I couldn't come back to Uruguay or to Argentina for many years after Michelini was murdered, because we were working very closely together, and I stayed in touch with Mario, who was in Peru and then in Cuba, however we could, and he traveled some, so about once a year, if we were on the same continent at the same time, we would share a meal, and we wrote to each other. And we also had a lot of other mutual friends and connections. And when I could come back here, I came back, started to spend a lot of time here again. And he came back, he had been living in Spain for many years, and when his wife, who had Alzheimer's, got sick, Luz, he realized, he felt that he could get better care for her here than he could in Spain because he knew everybody, and that they would have a better support system to help him, to help the two of them get through that. So he came back at about the same time. And then it was easier for us to spend time together. And so I spent a lot of time with them during those years, both with him and with Louise, to the degree, you know, as she got worse and worse, to the degree that she was able to maintain social relationships. So that's a long answer to your short question.
To describe Mario Benedetti, and do you have any anecdotes that you would like to share with us?
How would I describe him? He was one of the most, there's no adjective in English for solidario. He was one of the most solidario people I've ever known. Yeah, there is none. You know, in a sense, that's a cultural difference. It's not that we don't help each other out, but there's a sense in which solidarity is practiced here that I've never seen it practiced, or seldom seen it practiced in the United States, and that's one of the things I find so compelling about this. It's one of the things I love about Uruguay. It keeps bringing me back. He was one of the least assuming people I've ever met. He wasn't conceited. He was always a little surprised about how successful he was. But like any human being, he had an ego. And one really funny thing that used to happen, he was very much what we call a creature of habit in English. He had a routine, and the older he got, the more difficult it was for him not to follow his routine. That happens to a lot of us as we get older. And he ate pretty much the same things every day for lunch in the same bar on the corner of where he lived. And everybody in Montevideo knew that if they wanted to see Benedetti, they had to walk, and he sat at the same table. They had to walk past the window where you could see that table at a certain time of day, and they would see Benedetti. It was guaranteed. And I used to go eat with him when I was down here at least once a week, sometimes more often. And at that point, we were working together on translating some of his work. And we sometimes, it was largely social, but sometimes we would be trying to talk about some specific problem that I was trying to solve. And we could never finish a sentence because everybody in Montevideo who wanted to see him would show up with their books to be autographed, and they would keep interrupting us. And it got annoying sometimes because there were times when we really wanted to talk. And he would, you know, very patiently sign these books and say hello to everybody. And then a lot of people would come in there. Several other writers ate lunch there, and other people would come by and they'd see him and they'd stop in to say hello. And sometimes we'd get a little bit annoyed because we couldn't finish a sentence. But if one day we were able to finish all our sentences and he wasn't interrupted at all, he would look at me sadly and say, "Everyone's forgotten me." It was a very mixed thing. So he did have an ego. He was a human being. Another really, really funny anecdote was when he was much old and increasingly fragile, and he had trouble walking. And I think it was, I don't even remember what year it was, when George W. Bush came to Montevideo. Yeah. Yeah. It was 2000 something. Yeah, because he died when? 2009? 2009. So this must have been 2006, 2007, something like that. And he lived a block away from 18 de Julio on Selma Michelini Street. And when George W. Bush came, there was a huge anti-Bush demonstration where everybody got together to walk down 18 de Julio, which is where demonstrations happen. You know? And when Mario was in no shape physically to be at a demonstration because he couldn't walk, and I know, because now my back is getting old, that if you have trouble walking, demonstrations are held because you have to walk really slowly in crowded circumstances and you wind up
Demonstrations, una manifestación.
Yeah, so it's very hard to do if you're not physically fit. It's easier to walk faster on an open street than it is to walk very slowly, all crowded in. So he wasn't going to miss that demonstration, but he couldn't do it. So his personal secretary and I negotiated with him about how to deal with the demonstration. We said, okay, we'll go down to the corner with you, and you can wave to the demonstration when it goes by, and that'll be easier for you. And he agreed to that. So we go downstairs and we walk, and it's hard, you know, the half block to the corner. And here comes the demonstration, and suddenly they realize that Mario Benedetti is on the corner, and the whole demonstration comes running over to the corner. And it was the most amazing scene I have ever seen, because here were high school girls pulling volumes of his poetry out of their mochilas, out of their backpacks, to hand over to be autographed. And they didn't know he was going to be there. So they must have carried those books around all the time of his poetry. And they were handing them over to be autographed. And young couples were coming over and saying, can we take a picture with you? Or would you take a picture with my girlfriend? Or would you take a picture with my boyfriend? And there were several boys that came over and pulled off their sweaty t-shirts and handed them over, these dirty t-shirts, to be autographed. It was really quite funny. And after about 20 minutes of that, he was absolutely exhausted. And we, Ariel, the secretary, and I were saying, you know, Mario, we really ought to go home. No, we really ought to go home. And finally he said, yes, let's go home because I don't want them to forget what this demonstration is about.